Good afternoon and thank you for being online today. I'm going to step away from some of those broader ideas about success for everyone, and instead I'm going to zoom in and look at something that is a specific classroom area that students often need support with, and that's academic writing at Key Stage 3. Now, this is a time in the students' lives where we want them to write as undergraduates to be. Many of them are going off to university. We want them to be able to write fluently, academically, professionally, in a way that really shows off what they know, what they understand. Now, this can be something that stumps students, and it can mean that students who up until Key Stage 4 were writing perfectly serviceable answers suddenly struggle to make that step up at Key Stage 5. I'm fairly certain that I am not the only teacher who has had a comment along the lines of the one on the screen, which is a student knows what they're expected to do, but they don't know how to do it. They don't know how to achieve that effect. Now, I think some of the problem is that as teachers, we often give feedback based on the marks scheme. This is something that many schools encourage, that we've had suggested to us that we do. And sometimes we do that marked up as pro formas, sometimes as handwritten comments, and sometimes as whole class feedback. And it seems logical because the mark scheme is what is going to be used to mark a piece of work. But the problem is that the mark scheme is designed for people like us. It's designed for experts who understands the techniques and the ideas that are described in it, rather than for the students who we are trying to teach. And this means, unless we give them very, very careful feedback, we risk telling the students very, very little about how they can improve future pieces of work. Phrases like display more detailed knowledge, or come to a rational conclusion, or develop your answer, which could be drawn from, for example, the mark schemes on the screen, are pretty meaningless if, as a student, you don't know how to do that. The mark schemes that are on the screen, the little snapshots, make it clear that these documents are about experts marking pieces of work, allocating marks to work that has already been completed. They're not a guide for how to complete it. They're not an instruction manual. And therefore, students often find themselves thinking, well, if I knew how to do that, I would have done it. And therefore, I would have got the marks. So how can we help our students more effectively? Well, after many years of making the mistakes I've described, I now try and teach writing much more explicitly. And in doing so, I have stolen ideas from people like Doug Lemov, Judith Hochman and her Writing Revolution, which is an excellent book, Joshua Balance, who's written blogs around explicit writing instruction. And I would really recommend going to read what people like this have to say, because it's really influenced the way that I teach. To describe my very basic method, I start off by collecting in work. I take apart students' writing and I think about what I would have done instead. And I might sometimes, well, quite often actually, write my own answer and make a comparison. And when I make that comparison, when I think about the differences between my writing and the students' writing, I think about the tricks that I'm employing, the techniques that I'm using. And these are ones that I tend to have developed implicitly over years of reading and writing. They're things that have come to me because I have absorbed the writing of others. So I try to think about how I can teach those to my students in a way that will make their writing better, and in a way that they will understand why they are using their techniques, how to use them, and therefore they too will write more fluently. So I'm going to give 3 examples. They're not the only examples, they're not the only techniques that I teach, but they are 3 that I have used fairly recently and that I have seen the outcomes of. So the first one is teaching students to add context and improve their style by introducing the people that they discuss with an identifier. So in politics, students often have to talk about key thinkers. And I was getting a lot of answers that opened, J.S. Mill said, Betty Friedan said. And this is quite boring. And it also means that the quote or the idea that follows is not very well contextualized. So that was an issue. It also was the case that students were mixing thinkers up. In liberalism, there are about 5 Johns, and the Johns were getting very confused. And so we wanted to make sure that students knew exactly who they were talking about each time. So what I taught students to do was to use an identifier at the beginning of each sentence that they discussed a thinker to introduce that thinker. And to help them do this, I gave them a task where they had to develop identifiers for each of the thinkers we have studied. And you can see an example of that on the screen. This had the added bonus of getting them to revise and summarise their learning about the background of that thinker. But it also gave them a set piece introduction that they could use in their writing. And it reminded me a little bit, for the classicists of you out there, of kind of the set piece introductions in something like the Odyssey or the Iliad, like Rosy Fingered Dawn, that kind of thing. So as they started to use these, it became clear that their writing was much more informative, it read much more maturely, and it sounded more like the work of an expert. And that was more interesting to read, and it also made them feel prouder about their writing. The second technique was instructing them to strengthen their point by using a subordinating conjunction in their opening point. So students' essay points were often very brief and they said very little, and that limited their value within the essay, and it sometimes meant that the following argument drifted, it lost its way, it was talking generally around the subject rather than analysing the specific ideas they needed to analyse. So I taught students to append a subordinating conjunction and a clause to their point in order to explain the how or the why of the point they were making. And this helped them to develop their point, it opened up their analysis immediately, and it helped keep the point on track. So the example on the screen, I would get a point something along the lines of, one way the Prime Minister's powers are restricted is through Parliament. Now that's true, but it's not very analytical. It doesn't really tell me a lot. And often it meant that the following answer, the following paragraph, would read just generally about Parliament, and it wouldn't really analyse how Parliament was restricting the Prime Minister's powers. So here instead, I've got them to add a subordinating conjunction, and then that's followed by a subordinating clause, which is all primary legislation must be scrutinised and passed by the House of Lords and the House of Commons. And what that does is it makes it clear how the PM's power is being restricted, and it helps the student to consider what it is that they need to discuss next in the paragraph. So that's technique 2. And then technique 3 was to open a conclusion with a contrasting preposition such as despite, and that was to improve evaluation. So students' conclusions were often the weakest part of their writing. It was just a statement of what they thought. There was no evidence of evaluation. There was no reflection on the preceding arguments. By opening with a contrasting preposition such as despite, students are forced to summarise both sets of arguments and then come to a conclusion. Now, that's not all an excellent conclusion needs by any means, but what it does create in Year 12 is a framework around which students can then learn to build a stronger, more evaluative conclusion. And you can see the example on the board. By using despite at the start, students have to reflect on both sides of the argument that they have discussed, and then also by finishing using words from the title, it makes sure they do come to a conclusion based on those. Well, I guess the big question is, has it helped? And I would say absolutely yes. My students' writing is still not perfect, but the writing of even the weaker writers reads as much more fluent, it reads more analytically, there's a degree of evaluation, it's definitely improved. Students, as a result, are far more successful, they feel more confident in their writing, they feel prouder of what they produce, and for me, marking is increasingly a pleasure. What they write is enjoyable to read. So what next? Well, the next step, other than identifying more techniques and sharing those, is building the teaching of those proactively into the curriculum rather than just as feedback to work. And that's something I've experimented with this year. So I taught a sequence of techniques to apply to an essay over a number of weeks. So we started with an essay title and we broke down how you would write very explicitly into several parts, and then the students wrote the full essay in November. And this meant that the first bit of work that I collected in off them was, or not the first bit of work, but the first 25-mark essay, the first extended piece of writing, was really high quality. And it meant that I could give feedback that was about their success, about what they had done well, and that's built a degree of confidence, it's built a degree of motivation, which I think is really, really important. The other step is over to you. These are things that I have spotted while I've been marking, while I've been feeding back, but there are 1,000,001 techniques that we employ when we write well. So if you want to share any of the techniques that you identify, that you teach students explicitly, that you have found has really improved their writing, then please do share them. We're at PolyMAT Schools on Twitter, and it will be really interesting to see what other people have been doing. So thank you for watching today, and I hope you have a lovely rest of the afternoon. Bye-bye.